And that's a book which is called Founders, which essentially talks about and I had a chance to interview all those folks last April, last August rather, and one of them was Richard Goldstone, who was the founding prosecutor of the Rwandan Tribunal. Given your research on what happened and what occurred, what's your sense of even the tribunal, which is really the follow-up and the gathering of the evidence of much of what you saw and gathered?
It is and it isn't. The tribunal in Rwanda is very different from the sort of whole reckoning of the genocide. And I think after Nuremberg, there was a kind of romanticization of the overall power or possibility of these tribunals. So that when they started up again in the 90s, there was this idea that by holding trials, one would essentially be writing history. I think that's a big mistake. Trials are trials. History is history. Trials sometimes come to conclusions that are not what happened. They're what's able to be proven according to a point of law in that court of law by those lawyers with the evidence that they found against the rules of the court and the success of the defenders. That's very different from what happened. One could easily imagine a situation, Rwanda Tribunal's a good one, where somebody like Twanest Bagasora, who was in many ways the mastermind of the genocide, was not ultimately convicted of the crime of genocide, and was convicted of other crimes that are ingredients of genocide, but the prosecution failed to prove, within the rules and technicalities of the court, to the satisfaction of that group of judges in that court at that point, that the case of the exact legal terms of genocide had been proven adequately. No historian of any seriousness about the Rwandan genocide questions Bagasora's role as an author of the genocide. So I think that one has to distinguish between what a court can do. Does that mean that the court is not doing its job or not doing something fantastically important? No, it does something else. In this particular case, it dealt with a tiny country out of which a rather large genocidal movement exploded as soon as it was over. So they fled. They were in other countries. And this country was quite weak in international standing, especially in its ability to chase down and get those people. And the international community, as in its various instruments, decided, well, we'll set up this tribunal, and then there'll be somebody to hand them over to. So countries that were wary, for rightly or wrongly, of, one can argue, I mean, people can argue about that, of handing over a former government official to Rwanda, which didn't have very well established courts yet, decided they could hand them over to the tribunal. And this was of value to Rwanda too, in terms of getting these people out of circulation, but also in a situation where you had a genocide that was contested, as like whether it was a genocide and how the propaganda of it worked and what the role of the international community was. The international community itself had tried to pretend it wasn't a genocide so it wouldn't have to intervene during the thing, the Clinton administration and so forth. This now established that that same community was saying, yes, actually it was. That had value, especially when people are still fighting over like what these definitions are. It was slow in the way that courts can be. It was not capable of dealing with the caseload that Rwanda needed, which was, the crime was also committed by hundreds of thousands of people inside Rwanda. So there were these two parallel things. And then there was bad blood between the Rwandans and the tribunal, understandably, because they both have political interests of their own, purposes of their own. Some of that was about accusations about what the Rwandan government, the people in the government when they were rebels, had been doing in '94, and whether their crimes were being prosecuted as war crimes. And like any other government on earth, they refused to cooperate in that process. But a lot of it was also about a feeling that there was a kind of poor integration of the fact that it was being held at all in these courts, rather than that the international community invested in Rwanda's legal system, cast a kind of inevitable question mark over Rwanda's legal proceedings. it made them seem like maybe they weren't up to snuff. So Rwanda then invested a lot of its energy in getting direct extraditions. They actually were fighting over extraditions from the very beginning for specific prisoners. Could we get Frode Karamira from Ethiopia, or does the tribunal? And there'd be like a tribunal guy and a Rwandan on a plane with their, arrest warrants going to Addis Ababa or something. And so there were these interesting tensions between them that I think played out over time. I think that the value of the International Tribunal for Rwanda is huge, which is that it did catch these people who otherwise would have been probably able to exercise the bits of remaining power they had to get lost in the international system.
Wasn't it the first time that a tribunal that actually ruled that the abuse of sexual powers was in fact couldn't rise to the definition of genocide? It
was the first, I think, international court. I'm not sure about national courts.
Yeah,
but I mean, I'm not sure whether national courts had used the international laws to rule that, but it definitely was, and it happened to be the first trial. Although it was by no means a person of any importance in the structure of the genocide. I mean, it was not an unimportant person, but it just and it wasn't what they went after him for at first. Yeah. He kind of fell into their lap, right? In Zambia, I think he was picked up. Maybe, I'm not sure if it was Zambia, but I think it was Zambia. And he was recognized as a mayor who'd been important in the genocide. And then as they started investigating, like, who is this guy we actually have? They started to learn this rape story, and to their credit, the prosecutors decided to go after that, and were able to get it established that rape as a crime of war and genocide. So that's an important legal precedent.
I'm from just south of the Buffalo area and very much aware of Alison DeForge. What did she mean to you?
Alison was a crucial researcher on the genocide in its early days. She became very attached to the tribunal a witness there, an expert witness, as a number of academics did. And I felt like much of her writing on the genocide was really important documentation and putting things together. It was crucial.
What drew you to Rwanda, of all the places, of all the gin joints in all the world? You are drawn to that unique, unfortunate 800,000 people dying.
Well, it's also the millions who lived that actually keep me going back. I went there first. I'd been actually writing about some refugee issues, and it was at the moment of the genocide in '94. Obviously, there weren't a lot of reporters, and there wasn't a lot of very good coverage able to happen inside Rwanda. But as soon as the genocidaires started to flee to the perimeter of the country, to the refugee camps, you started to have a lot of coverage of that. So I was very aware of it also as a refugee story, and of the refugees returning with the RPF that formed the new government. It's not what I ended up writing about. I'm just saying, you're asking why I was also very aware of how much coverage Bosnia was getting. And that here, as far as I could tell, something even more unambiguously a mass genocide of exactly the kind that fits the definition had taken place in a very small country where there wasn't all that much ethnic cleansing. It was just elimination. And now, how are people supposed to live in such a place? And then I was really interested in the whole rhetoric around intervention that we had, this was when we were opening the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and the Schindler's List was out. There was this whole sort of never again moment in American life, in the post-Cold War moment also, that we are now able to deal with these human rights issues as international policy. And in fact, we turned away. And thinking about that. So I went with questions that were really actually, if you think about it, much more about us than about them. And as soon as I got there, I got very interested in them. And that's why I've kept going back, because the experience that they had and of how they talk about it, and which is it's not like they're two separate stories, but the story of how they moved on, for better and for worse in those years and since, has been incredibly absorbing, and also kind of a deep political education all the time.
How are the Rwandans, how do they treat you? I mean, you've written so much about this. You're now working on your second book, right, on this. And you're known for that and your scholarship. How do they treat you? I mean, do they treat you as a...
Well, a lot of them don't know that. I mean, I don't only deal with officials. So there are people whom I've interviewed many times over the years who've never seen anything of mine. I'd be happy to give it to them, but they wouldn't be able to read it. And I've told them that I've written about it. I think one thing they see is that it doesn't have consequences for them, which is interesting. I had one moment years ago, because it's a pretty controlling and intensive government, intensively administered state, where I had, this was in the late 90s, I'd written about a killer who had just come back from the camps in Congo and expected to be arrested, but I didn't know what had happened and I had to go home. And then there was an insurgency at that time in the country and you couldn't get back to the village entirely safely. And there was a government official at that point who saw that I was in town, and he said, you know, whatever happened to that guy? I read that story. I'm so fascinated. What happened? I said, what do you mean, what happened? Don't you have people? You live here. I just got back. He said, I don't know. We don't, you know, we don't keep track of everybody. Go out. And I said, well, it's not safe. I don't want to get anybody also killed because they're talking to me. And he said, well, I'll send you with some soldiers. I said, that's even worse, right? I'm not going to go anywhere with soldiers. I never have. And never would. It was an absurd offer. I said, you know, are you trying to help me or are you trying to destroy me as a journalist? I would never do that. So I went back many years later and learned what happened because the place became safe again. In the government or in the cab, I mean, I sometimes get to speak to people and sometimes I don't. I have people that I've talked to over the years. I think that's helped a lot. They don't have to feel that you agree with them on everything. They have to feel that you're relatively fair to them, that you represent, that when you quote them, you give the argument they gave. Which is true. I don't have a particular agenda. People who were implicated? Yeah, there are people who were implicated. For the most part, they've been through some kind of a reckoning. The ones who are genuinely like that the fingers are pointed, and some people are outraged when they first get appointed. There are some pretty incredible cases. Like there's the case of a guy named Paul Warakabije, who was he wasn't a super important figure during the genocide, but he was immediately afterwards. When the Hutu power forces end up in exile in Congo, he was the leader of the insurgency inside Rwanda in the late 90s, and then of the FDLR, which was the sort of main rebel group inside Congo. So the genocidal army in exile. And at a certain point, he surrendered and came home and was reintegrated. And there was a Gacaca trial for him, one of the communal courts. I went to some of those sessions because they were in Kigali when I was there. And I mean, it's impossible to know exactly what happened because it was a trial about something a while back, and I don't know how complete it was. The feeling was that he was not likely to get convicted from the beginning, not because he was only a government guy, but because he'd become a government guy because he wasn't the most implicated, right? But what's interesting is they're bracketed this, the crimes that were committed afterwards, which are huge, right? There were like massacres, many of them, orchestrated by his army. Those are not prosecuted. Those are treated as part of the war that followed. Not both sides kind of like, if we're going to deal with each other, we have to let some of that stuff go. But it's extremely intense responses people have to the idea of reintegrating such people. There was a governor from the Northwest also who became the governor, but these are calculated moves by the government. They said, we were starting to have success kind of making the people in the Northwest realize like we could be their government too, and that we weren't just there to break them. And that's the sort of Hutu area around which a lot of the genocidaires had come from. And they said, yeah, but we want one of our own. Like they started to realize if we could get one of them to work with us, who's a good politician, who knows how to communicate with them, meaning a good politician, meaning like he's just, you know, knows how to get across to people, knows how to lead, knows how to, and they're his people. And they see that, then they'll believe it in a way that none of us can make them believe it by ourselves. So this is how you make peace. You don't make peace with your friends and your cronies. They're your friends and your cronies. You make peace with your enemies by making deals that are often unsavory to your own ideology and the thing you fought for, except that you've decided it's a preferable way to go.
Do you ever fear for yourself?
Not in recent years. In the early times, there were times where it was hairy. There were wild people running around and without, very lawlessly, and both in Rwanda and across the border in Congo. And occasionally, there'd be either a situation or a confrontation that was menacing, but not for the most part. And the reality is that unless you were very, very politically involved, white people meaning foreign people, and this was basically true of non-white foreign people too, were for the most part not targeted.
So I've had a chance to interview several of the prosecutors. They have their investigation teams, and I'm just trying to think that as they were doing investigations, just ultimately trying to implicate folks to gather information, which ultimately may lead to an indictment and a particular prosecution. Did anybody kind of feel you were doing the same thing? The distinction between an investigator for the purposes of prosecution and an investigator for the purposes of journalism?
I exchanged notes with some of them at times, or talked to some of them. There was the book's title, "We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We'll Be Killed with Our Families," comes from a note that was written by a pastor in Western Rwanda, Seventh-day Adventist pastor, to his flock, or the Tutsis from his flock, and to the Tutsi ministers from his church, who had all holed up in that church seeking refuge when the killing began, and had written him a note saying, "Dear pastor, we wish to inform you that we have learned that tomorrow we will be killed with our families, and we hope that you may intervene on our behalf the way Esther intervened for the Jews." And he then told them, "Nothing I can do for you," and they were killed. And he was then under investigation by the Tribunal for having helped orchestrate both that massacre and something else. That was the accusation. And it had become clear that he'd fetched up in Laredo, Texas, because he had a son there who'd immigrated years before and was not implicated, but he'd moved in with him. And there was the pastor, and there was another son of his who had been in Rwanda at the time, who was also, and the Tribunal ended up getting both of them. They arrested him in Laredo. I got to him first by a day or two, and they arrested him, I think, within 48 hours. And then he was not easy to find in Laredo. I'm sure they had an easier time of it, but his son had an unlisted number and had slightly changed his Rwandan name, and but I found him. I doorstepped him and went in there, and they had a Rwandan maid who let me in to their gated community. Probably they regret that, but he had then given me the letter himself. He thought it was exculpating, and the other people thought it was, the people who remembered it at the time remembered it as inculpating, and I didn't really have a basis to rule on that case, right? I wasn't saying he did it, he didn't. I said he's very accused, and this is how people see what he did and how it's perceived, and this is how he spins it. And then he went to the tribunal, and he was convicted. And I think he died in there. He was a pretty old man by then, and he, I believe, died in one of their prisons in maybe Senegal.
Is it easy for you to draw a parallel to the United States reaction to the information they got at the concentration camps during World War II, and sort of knew about it but didn't react the way history looks at it as if they should have, and how the Clinton administration similarly had information and wasn't quite sure they wanted to follow what had happened in Somalia? Can you draw that?
Well, I see what you're saying, and I think there are analogies. I think the real analogy between the U.S. indifference to intelligence about the concentration camps in World War II and their awareness that there was a genocide going on in Rwanda, not wanting to do anything. Mm-hmm. I think the real connection is that in both cases, that is not what moves American decisions about the use of force. The difference is that in World War II, America was hammering away at Nazi Germany at that point. They were involved in a full-tilt war effort, and the question was, do we divert the resources from fighting the war the way that we've decided to fight it to eliminate Nazi Germany to like go and bomb the train lines or something like that, and show our hand also that we know it, blah, blah. I mean, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that it was in the context of a major intervention, as major as we've ever done. Yeah. So I know people who know a lot more about this debate it. I don't know, but I just know that that's a difference in context to me. Then here, we just didn't want to be involved, and we didn't want anybody else to be involved if we weren't. There was this thing where Bill Clinton comes in, and he's on the campaign trail talking about a sort of robust policy of humanitarian intervention. Then he comes in and he inherits Somalia from George Bush, and you have the Black Hawk Down incident, and American servicemen drag their bodies through the streets of Mogadishu, and he pulls out of there, and he also retreats from Haiti. They have a ship that turns around in the harbor when people are throwing stones at it, and you get this image of America in retreat from the fear of having to take casualties in defense of these principles that he had put forward. When he'd come in, he'd started by commissioning what's called the Presidential Decision Directive. And he had asked that it should be a kind of elaborate policy statement of all the reasons to get involved in international humanitarian interventions militarily. Well, by the time it came out, it had been retooled, according to their instructions, to be like a checklist of all the reasons not to. It was called PDD 25, Presidential Decision Directive 25, and it was produced either in late March or early April of 1994. It drops right into place as the genocide happens. And it's more or less what Madeleine Albright had in her hand when she got her instructions to go to the UN and say, not for us, right? And one of the things in that document that's always struck me is that it says, essentially, if we should decide not to, this is not for us to get involved, we should sort of discourage, or others should not go in our place. Whether that was exactly a kind of American exceptionalism and the idea that we, America, should only lead and shouldn't, whatever it was, it made it even harder then to get others to go in. So that was the context that was a little more specific to Rwanda than, say, we're, part of this Allied invasion of Europe and not going after the lines. But I think that what they tell us is, and we saw it in Kosovo, we've seen it in many places, despite all the professions of common humanity and that there are certain crimes and certain offenses that we don't respect sovereignty and we should take action to end and never again, that's not what moves great powers to act, is humanitarian reasons. If there's strategic reasons, geopolitical reasons, and other reasons around it, that can be one of them. But we're not going to risk the capital and mostly the blood and the treasure. And that is very much the lesson that came away from Rwanda. Unfortunately, the lesson of Rwanda on that front is that they basically broke the intervention part of the Genocide Convention and were left only with the prevention and punishment. So the prevention got lost and the punishment is what we're left with, the tribunals.
Clinton subsequently did go and made sort of a quasi-apology, didn't he?
He did, and he got a lot of, rightly so, he got a lot of sort of rolled eyebrows, rolled eyeballs at that one because, it seemed like a cheap thing to do, right? Like it's easy. But I don't think it was easy at some level. Politicians don't usually go around looking for places to say that they really should have done otherwise when there's no pressure on them to do so. And there wasn't really a constituency he was going to win over in this country by doing that. And it did matter to Rwandans. Rwandans were much less cynical about it. They're cynical about what happened before, but they think the apology was a useful thing. Mm-hmm. They think, well, that helps set the record straight. That helps acknowledge what in fact happened here and acknowledge that people did know, which is part of what his apology said. What was particularly, I think, a bad look about it, like literally the look, is that when he did it, he came in on Air Force One and lands at Kigali Airport and didn't leave the tarmac. He came down the steps and gave his speech, and for whatever reason, the security forces or whatever, they wouldn't even let him sort of enter the country. And so it looked like a drive-by. And a little bit of like, here comes the President of the United States waving from his plane to say, oh, I'm so sorry you all died. That didn't look good. Yeah. But in fact, I think the alternative case, which is he didn't do that, would be less.
Yeah. How was the relationship between President Kagame and Clinton, in other words? I mean, how did that develop?
I think it was partly because of that apology, or that impulse on Clinton's part to... It also reset the relationship, right? In other words, up till then, and if you look at compare it to the relationship between Kagame and the Rwandan government and the UN with Kofi Annan or something, who refused to apologize always and dodged and said it was everybody and it wasn't me, where, you know, there's plenty of paper trail saying that he did not stand up either. I think Clinton wanted to make up is a little bit too strong, make up for it, but, well, if we can do some good now. Yeah. So he got involved. You can argue about whether the Clinton Foundation, how you like it or don't like it, but I mean, that was the impulse, I think, that why Rwanda rather than somewhere else. It wasn't, again, a sexy foundation destination at that point. And you know, some of the stuff that he funded there certainly contributed a lot to a real public health revolution in Rwanda. You know, he was very involved with that, with the Clinton Foundation. I don't know about all the rest of that relationship. Kagame,
you've, I think, portrayed him quite well as sort of the post-genocide leader to put Rwanda kind of where it is today. I mean, do you still hold that view?
He is the guy. I mean, he's the consequential figure. You know, he's obviously controversial, and some people define him only by his offenses or what they don't find acceptable about him. Some define him only by like a kind of heroic. There's a sort of God. You know, God. He's either the Messiah or he's the devil. Mm-hmm. I don't find those very useful ways to reckon with him, or most political leaders. You know, who aren't generally gentle, and if they're getting anything done. And I think the verdict's out on him, is what I always say, and it will be until he's out of office. Because one of the most important aspects of Rwandan history and backdrops to the genocide and everything else is that there had never been a peaceful transfer of power in Rwandan history. Certainly not in modern history, and very few living ex-leaders, to be honest about it.
Yeah.
So, and then it's highly explosive place. So once you've stabilized and taken a bunch of strong moves to try to create what many people think of as a sturdier and stabler and thriving or possible society, that transfer of power, that transition, that succession is a critical element. Is it après-moi le déluge, or is it something that we can't see, but maybe it'll work out, in which case I think his position will look better? Or is it in fact that sometime before, you know, because it's not a question simply of term limits, which some people want to put it at. Why, he's been there 25 years. Well, that's a very long time for a single party leader to be in a place. And it doesn't seem to me, as a general rule, a desirable thing. But, you know, there are German chancellors who've been around for 20 years and so forth, and it's not undemocratic because of the terms. It seems to me a question of mortality and structures. There isn't a structure in place. Right. Rwandans have to fear life without Kagame, more than life with Kagame, no matter what they think of that. That's not a resolved situation. And so that seems to me to be the big question mark over this quarter of a century that we've been through, is how it will look when that man leaves the stage.
Did your paths cross with his?
I've interviewed him a number of times. I mean, they've never really crossed except across a table with a tape recorder.
Is that an easy thing for you to get access to, or do you have to really...
It varies. there are times when he wants to talk, and he talks to a number of foreign journalists, and when you talk to him, he really talks. I mean, he just sits down, he talks, he clears his schedule for 2, 3, 4 hours sometimes and talks. And I once had an interview, I haven't spoken to him in 7 or 8 years. I mean, I've put in requests, and I don't request to see him every time I go by any means, but it hasn't worked out. But it's not like, I've never had the impression that it's a decision beyond each time. And a lot of it has to do with what you say. They want to figure out what you want to talk about, whether he wants to talk about that right then. So no, when I've said I would like to talk about some of these succession issues, I haven't been re-invited.
Do they, just out of curiosity, do they in advance ask you your scope of questions and
I mean, I don't have to write out questions, but generally, what's this one about? And it rarely ends up being only. I mean, I've never had it where they say, "Well, you didn't say you were going to talk about that." He's not like that. He's very confident talker, and so you don't always get to ask or steer it the way you want to. Even if you ask the question, he might just move on, But broadly speaking, if they're like, well, what are you focused on? You say, well, so here are a couple of things that I definitely am going to want to ask him about. And you don't want to seem like if you want to be able to ask again someday, you don't want to totally sneak up on them with something. And so I feel like, fine, here it is. I'm not going to tell you what about it I'm going to ask. Here it is. And they're people who have an institutional history. They've seen you work over the years, and but I thought it was interesting once that I was interviewing him, and I walked. They bring you in. It's the presidency. It's a big rigmarole. You have to come an hour early. So you end up I get brought into this conference room to wait. So I'm just sitting there, and all of a sudden he just walks in, and normally there's somebody with him, and he had the same reaction. He kind of looks at it and he says, "So, what's this? It's just us?" And I said, "This is your place. I don't have any control over that. I'm alone." And he said, "Well, that's not right. Okay, let's talk." And then he got up and he walked out first, and he summoned a press secretary, or more than a press secretary, somebody, one of his aides, and said, there should always be somebody in here when I'm talking to a serious reporter, because essentially he said, like, that's where I might say things that we want to remember. It wasn't to check me. It wasn't that, because they often, they always put down a tape recorder too. But it was like, it was as if he admitted or acknowledged that something that all of us have noticed who've ever interviewed him, that he's thinking out loud. He's like, this is where I work things out, basically. Somebody should be here because this is where I will talk about some things that I may not have really talked about before. And it should become understood. And that was interesting because there are very few, most people want somebody in the room to make sure that they don't talk about something they haven't talked about before, or to control them. And he likes getting into it.
Anything off the record?
Or he did. I mean, I haven't talked to him in a long time, and I think he's more guarded these days.
So do they? Just out of curiosity, is that something where they lead you into saying, "This is off the record, I'll tell you," or they tell you and say that was off the record?
He's a president. He's never off the record. Okay. He actually isn't.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if he ever. I once said something like, he sort of looked at my tape recorder. Like, so now what are we going to do? He starts saying something, and he looks at it like, he points at it like, I'm not going to say it. And I said, well, you want to go off is this something you want to say after? It turned out that he just said, like, turn it off for a second. It was something that was so specific to, like, the next day he was flying to some African heads of state meeting. And although he knows I don't publish the next day, he didn't want that, like, to name somebody's name to finish the sentence, because he was going to see them in another context the next day. It's typical politician stuff, or leader stuff. It's not a bad thing. It's just that they are thinking in the next cycle. They're thinking about what they're doing right that minute. They're not thinking, oh, this guy's going to write a book in a year, or he's going to write an article in 6 months. That's an unimaginable future in terms of political consequences of a conversation.
You're terrific. This is fun. But before they give me the hook, you wrote an article entitled, "What is John Bolton's bully pulpit attack on the International Criminal Court really about?" Can you give me a 5-minute Reader's Digest of your feelings about that?
I should look at that article again.
While you think about it, just the context, we spend a lot of time with Fatou Bensouda, and before that, Luis Moreno Ocampo, and the International Criminal Court certainly is under public siege.
Sure. I mean, and there are many complaints that one could have about aspects of the International Criminal Court, including cases that they've brought, and I think they're going to run into this now with Bashir from the Sudan, now that the Sudanese are talking about turning him over, that it's one thing to indict him for genocide in Darfur when you never expect to get your hands on him, but when you actually have him coming in, you better have a really strong case. And some of these cases have not been as strong as they should be, and they're highly political, and they're attacks on... I think Bolton's attack was basically a kind of crude defense of sovereignty and the idea that American soldiers should never be beholden to any laws, but should be protected from being accountable to laws that, in fact, are our laws. The fact is that the Geneva Convention, which some American politicians like to talk about as if it was some Swiss, frilly code that not some neutral country generated this silly code that they want to impose on real countries like ours. In fact, according to American military doctrine, the Geneva Convention is American military doctrine. And if there's any conflict between American military doctrine and the Geneva Convention, military doctrine is that the Geneva Convention prevails. So we have subordinated, as a matter of sovereignty, our rules of war to that document. But people talk about it like, oh, here come the Europeans with their fine ways, trying to put the handcuffs on some real Americans, right? And so that was that. A lot of it was this rhetorical bluster. And it ends up being, the reality is nobody's going to be able to get a hold of American troops if we don't cooperate. We're not even members of the court anyway. So if you're not members of the court, they can't fully come after you. But he was trying to scare off this investigation. And he was also auditioning, obviously, at that point. I don't think he was the National Security Advisor yet, was he? I'm trying to remember. But I don't believe he was. I think he was this was at the Federalist Society, and he was giving this big, grandiose speech, attacking the court for something it wasn't quite doing. And it becomes this very odd idea that you hear a lot from the Trump administration, that international institutions threaten American sovereignty. Now, it's one thing for European countries sometimes to have politicians who say, well, we've given up sovereignty to be part of the EU, because they have. They don't fully control their borders, their armies, their money in the same way that they might as sovereignty. We do. The UN is an instrument of American power more than it is in any way a hindrance to it. And it is an organization of sovereign states. It's all about defending sovereignty. It's all about defending your country against international meddling by another country. It suggests that there are these international standards, but it has no real enforcement clout. So it's basically a straw man, the way that they play it out, and this has been Bolton's game for a long time, to promote a kind of nationalist, jingoist rhetoric, and kind of, blow smoke.
Yeah. You're terrific. Thank you so much for spending time.
That's a pleasure.
It's funny how this Bolton, when they, I'll conclude on this, that when he announced that they would not grant visas to prosecutors who were investigating, it directly impacted the Robert Jackson Center, because Fatou Bensouda, the chief prosecutor, was scheduled to come, and she could not get her visa early enough to commit. So she had to telecast in, Skype in her comments because of this. Ultimately, they rescinded all that. but it was directly influenced.
Well, I mean, part of the problem, America has played the court both ways, the International Criminal Court specifically, which is that it has not ratified. It's not a member of the court. It doesn't subject itself to its authority, but it uses it. So, for instance, when Bosco Ntaganda, the Congolese warlord who was arrested some time back after fleeing into Rwanda, and the Rwandans handed him over. For a long time, they'd been putting pressure on the Rwandans to go find him in Congo and get him, somehow to arrange for his transfer. And they kept saying, first of all, why is this coming from America? You guys aren't members of the court. Why are you using that instrument? And second of all, he's in Congo. They have a president. Why don't you go talk to him? Don't try to make this my problem to solve. Now, obviously, there was a lot of politics around that, and there were reasons for that. But still, the idea that America both denounces the court all the time, but also uses it at times to achieve its ends. This is my critique of the way that it's structured. It basically it makes the court a two-tiered system, right? It is justice for some, but not for all. It's the idea that the law, we want to use this court to impose laws to which we do not submit. That is kind of the definition of injustice.
Yeah. I know a number of times where they've abstained from the Security Council in order to permit an assignment from the United Nations to referral to the International Criminal Court.
Right.
Same thing.
Right. So it's sort of like you use it as a back channel, and it's one more tool in their toolbox. Yeah. But you can understand why that also makes it look less legitimate in the eyes of the people who are being called to it. If it's like the people who are handing them over are saying, yeah, but that's just for you little guys.
Yeah. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.